How you doing?
Eddie Murphy, the funniest man in America.
Once you have a man with no legs, you never go back, baby.
In Trading Places, the funniest comedy of the summer.
I can see! I can see! I have legs!
Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy in Trading Places. Some very funny business.
Freeze, slimeball!
Moi?
Trading Places, rated R.
Starts Wednesday at a
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Not Content Podcast. My name is Jerome Cuson. As always, we are going to be discussing movies and TV as part of the From the Q Podcasting Network. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. Please leave a 4 or 5-star review. You can also find us on YouTube. Click the bell icon for notifications. Click the subscribe button. In addition to all of that, we are going to be discussing Trading Places. Eddie Murphy month continues here in the month of March. I know that Brian is so excited to be talking about Eddie Murphy, and what an unheralded classic, in my opinion, this is. Brian, I have to say, and look, I always feel contractually obligated to mention that John Landis, the director of this movie, is responsible for the the death of multiple people. So I always have to put that in context because John Landis is a terrible person. But that does not take away from the fact that this movie is really, really good. And you can see why John Landis was such a heralded comedic director. And again, I am not defending him as a human being. But this movie, man, this movie rules. It is absolutely hilarious. I think it has a lot to say. In some ways, Brian, the moon never changes, I guess.
The view never changes, Daddy. The view never changes. Look, I have similar feelings about Jimmy Snuka matches, okay? So if there's any equivalent caveat to that John Landis comment, man, it's definitely the Jimmy Snuka thing. Because every time I see a classic clip and my buddies are around, I go like, oh, that's the killer, Jimmy Snuka. And then they go, oh, don't say that. You're ruining the moment, blah, blah, blah. So I understand. And John Landis is responsible for the murder, or not the murder, but the death of 3 people. So there we go. But this movie, Jerome, is quite the classic for different reasons. Like, it pushes the boundaries of racism on film, but on the way of comedy, and like the fact that Dan Aykroyd at the end of the movie is dressed in blackface and is standing next to Eddie Murphy and they're all smiling together. I don't know. I had weird feelings about it now. I'm assuming people were laughing their ass off then. I was laughing my ass off now, but I kind of feel a little guilty about it now. But at the same time, it's like, did Eddie Murphy make it okay for that moment? I don't know. But that's part of like that line, that tippy-toe line that this movie plays in terms of race relations.
I'm not going to lie, Dan Aykroyd in blackface definitely took me back. I've seen this before, I feel like, but I did not specifically remember that moment.
I think it's because it's so heavy. The cut, like the, yeah.
It's wild to me. But there's so much else to talk about. I mean, it's just, you look at the construction of this movie and the conceit, like Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd are the patsies. I mean, to an extent, they're the main characters and they're the people that we primarily focus on, but they are not the drivers of the plot. And I think that's what's so exciting. And I guess there were various rumors about this potentially being a Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder script at one point, but it eventually evolves into Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy. But I don't know, man. I feel like I like Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, but Richard Pryor in movies, the charisma just didn't transfer. It's like Hulk Hogan. It's kind of similar to Hulk Hogan in that he's very charismatic when he is doing his own thing in wrestling, but when it comes to the movies, like, that doesn't translate. I feel the same way about Richard Pryor. Whereas with Eddie Murphy, like, he is one of the most charismatic human beings ever on SNL. And I've been watching, SNL videos and some sketches with him, and it's unbelievable. And I think it mostly transfers to the movies. Like, even in movies, I think you still lose a little bit of it because he's so good in sketch comedy. But like, you get 80 to 85% of it in the movies. And this one in particular, John Landis really lets it go wild.
Yeah, this movie works better with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy because this idea of, like, the stock market, that ties into yuppieism and all that shit that was going on in the 80s. And it wouldn't make sense to put Gene Wilder because he's too old for that role. Dan Aykroyd is in the right part of his life for that role, so it was perfect for him. He looked like that stupid yuppie you wanted to smack in the face in the 80s for talking about Wall Street numbers and being a Wall Street bro and all that bullshit. All this shit you see in this movie that he's like representing. It's great. It's like this great social commentary of like this whole character that Dan Aykroyd is like you hate him, and then you see he's getting comeuppance, and then you feel sympathetic for him, and then it's like, did he change at all? And I guess he kind of changes at the end. But at the same time, it's like you really see like this experiment that's going on, like this idea of, are we a product of our own nature, or are we a product of our environment? And I thought, great, this whole philosophical debate is layered in the background of this movie, and it's so fucking hilarious because it just plays out so well. But there are times where the script makes no sense because they have to fill in some things here and there for the plot to make sense. Like, where did all this money come from at the end for them to buy all that stock? You know what I'm saying? It's like, where did all that come from? But at the same time, it's like, that's not really the point of it all. The point of it is kind of to teach you these moral lessons and mix it in with some R-rated comedy. And that's kind of what John Landis was trying to do with this movie. I felt like he was just trying to do this social commentary with some moral, qualms, so to speak, like questionable things morally done by these rich dudes and how it plays out. So I also want to mention the names of the two bad guys in this movie, the Dukes. I don't know. It's just it reminded me of The Critic, right? Because of Duke. And B, it reminded me of Marley and Marley. And I don't know if that had anything to do with it because Marley and Marley is in the Muppet Christmas Carol, and that was 10 years later. But it wouldn't surprise me if they all came from the same family.
It's certainly possible. This movie was a pretty big box office success. This is a time when comedies can make $100 million, which is really impressive. But I think for me, the other thing that I want to mention, because Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy are unbelievable kind of in the lead roles. I have to give credit to Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici as well, kind of in their roles. I think Denholm Elliott as the butler, I think he does a great job. Jamie Lee Curtis, this could absolutely be a thankless role. The sex worker with a heart of gold is a well-worn trope in movies of all kinds, going back to the 50s and the 40s, for God's sakes. I mean, this is something that we have seen for so long throughout the history of Hollywood. But I think the way that she elevates this role and really takes a lot of agency, and the way that she talks about her own work. I mean, it's 1983, and I think that some of the words that are coming out of her mouth about sex work would still come across as progressive, and that says as much about our society as anything else. But I mean, I think we think of Jamie Lee Curtis as the scream queen, and she is, but she's a really good comedian as well. And I think this is a really good example. Just an incredibly well cast movie, and a movie that I think is underrated. Like, I feel like when people talk about Eddie Murphy, they immediately go to Beverly Hills Cop and they immediately go to Coming to America. But like, this is definitely a movie that Eddie Murphy specifically is designed. Like, this is a movie designed to make Eddie Murphy look good. And I think that John Landis, you can see why Eddie Murphy brought back John Landis for Coming to America, just because of how good he was here. I mean, he's excellent. And the thing that I respect about Dan Aykroyd and always have is he is very funny, but he is always willing to not be the funniest person in a scene. And I'm sure that a lot of that comes from his Second City background. I'm sure a lot of it comes from hanging around John Belushi all the time. But I really respect the fact that Dan Aykroyd is willing to play his role and to not try to eat up all of the scenery. I think that's what impresses me so much about Dan Aykroyd when he is at his best.
Yeah, I guess this is where we can have that slight discussion about, this idea that I guess studios thought he would be this big star, become a bigger star than what he became. I don't see it. I can kind of see it based on a movie like this, obviously, because he's got that charm to him. And you mentioned that his comic timing is great in this movie and he's willing to take a step back. But then, I see a movie like Dragnet, and I've seen clips of that movie, and I can't fathom a whole movie watching him talk like that, like Dragnet from the show, right? It just talks like that tone. So I don't know, just something about Dan Aykroyd just doesn't scream movie star to me, and I don't know what people were seeing, but I see him as like a great supporting guy. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I mean,
it makes sense.
he got nominated for Best Supporting Actor Academy Award for Driving Miss Daisy. So clearly, there was a time when people thought that Dan Aykroyd might be something, and I would agree with you. I think he's generally very bad in movies that he's the lead in. I can provide so many examples of him being bad, but whenever you put him in these, I mean, this is not. I mean, it's not strictly a supporting role. I mean, I would argue he's kind of a co-lead, but there really is a lot going on with Jamie Lee Curtis and Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici that this feels more ensemble than like Dan Aykroyd is the definitive lead. But again, I think Eddie Murphy is just so charismatic that I think Dan Aykroyd can kind of fade into the background and be okay. And I think the same is true for the Blues Brothers, another movie where Dan Aykroyd is purported to be the lead. But again, John Belushi can be the comedy. You've got so much music going on. You've got so many of these musical performers that I think it still comes across incredibly well. And I mean, again, I think this is what John Landis really knew how to use Dan Aykroyd, and I'm sure a lot of directors didn't. But yeah, it's such a fascinating time in Aykroyd's career because he's just coming off the passing of his friend, and I'm sure he's kind of trying to figure out like what his career is going to look like. And you get this, and then you get Ghostbusters, and it's like, well, Dan Aykroyd's off to the races, and then it kind of quickly crashes and burns. It's so fascinating to me that Dan Aykroyd was kind of the number one voice of comedy for the early '80s, and then by the '90s, it's like he's just got a parade of bombs.
But at least he had supporting roles in a good movie like My Girl, right? My Girl 2. Well, more so the first one. I don't know if you remember those early '90s, children.
He's not relying on being funny in those movies.
You're right. That's what I'm saying. Like he finally realized that he needed to be the supporting guy, and even at that age in the early '90s, he started to realize I'm not that young 20-year-old cat anymore that can do those kind of comedies. So he moved on to the more mature kind of comedies, right? So that's kind of my thoughts on Dan Aykroyd. I think he had a great start. It just, he finally found his place, towards the middle of his career instead of trying to go for these leading roles and stuff. But because Nothing But Trouble is like one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen, and that's a Dan Aykroyd lead. I think he directed as well.
My Stepbrother's an Alien. He was in North. I mean, he has been
in a lot of bad
movies.
Yeah, but of course Eddie Murphy is just stealing the show in this, obviously. And let's talk about Don Amici, because Don Amici had this career in the 50s and 60s before any of this, and he was running in the 80s. And then he gets this role in Trading Places, and then he gets another role immediately in Cocoon. And he wins the Academy Award playing an alien in Cocoon, or whatever it was. And that's that Ron Howard movie. That's really hard to find on Blu-ray, by the way. But it just kind of brought Don Amici back, and I guess he was this past star that kind of found a new audience in the 80s, and this role kind of just fit him because he's a great asshole. And speaking of great assholes, I can't find his name right now, but he's the principal from the Breakfast Club. He's Clarence in this, or whatever his name is. He's the one that's kind of like making Dan help.
Also has one of the best lines in Die Hard when he says, "I guess we're going to need more FBI guys."
Yes, he is like, I guess we mentioned it before, but he is one of the best assholes ever on screen. Like, he is such an asshole in this movie.
It's like a prototype version. This isn't like, he's definitely an asshole, but this is a prototype. This is not him fully formed.
Wow, because it feels like he's almost at the level of Breakfast Club, where he was just fully like, because in Breakfast Club, you can tell like he's added like a swag to it, to his assholeness. And this
he doesn't have swagger in this movie. Like, he's definitely an asshole, but he's not. There's no swagger.
The look at his face on the train, like, it's so good. Like, that's one of the things about the train scene that I find so interesting, is that everyone is in character, and if these different characters, like, from different nations, but his face is just so disgusted with everyone in that train. It's so good. Like, the look of disgust on his face is just so, like, unbelievable. He makes that role so well. And I don't know, just this idea of the stock market being compared to a sports book, it just popped me so hard, because I have the same feelings, which I'm sure 95% of the people at sports books and Wall Street feel too. It's the same. It's like betting with sports and betting with money, or betting with stocks. It's like the same kind of like up and down.
It's not even dealing with stocks. They're dealing in like futures and materials. Like, that's the thing that's so weird. You could not. You could probably sit me down for a full 8 hours, and I still wouldn't understand how to do this trading. Like it is a mystery, and it's not essential for the movie because the movie is funny regardless of whether you understand it or not. But there is just absolutely no way that I could make heads or tails of any of this.
Look, all I'll say is that I bought Victoria's Secret stock at a certain part of the year a couple years ago, and it was $16. And then I had this feeling like once it's going to hit February, it's going to go up. And I looked at the past history of the stock, and I was right. And I ended up making like $100 or something dollars off of just a random stock thing because I had a feeling. So it's kind of like that, you know what I'm saying? It's a mix of, a plus 300 or something like that, and you put it on a parlay or something crazy like that. So there's a lot of similarities, and I pop really hard for that fact. And if you don't understand it, just I don't know, watch Uncut Gems, and that's probably the easier version of that. The easier version of the stocks to understand is watch Uncut Gems. So there you go. But
so I have to say, one of my favorite aspects of this movie is that Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd are positioned to kind of be on opposite sides of the class war, but they come in the end to go after the real rich assholes. That is something that I also very, very much appreciate is the fact that they come together, they work together, and that's what leads to the big blackface scene. And Jamie Lee Curtis also participates as well. But I really love the fact that they're on the same side at the end, and they come to sort of an agreement. And I think with Eddie Murphy and his persona, I think he's always kind of crooked. We saw that in 48 Hours. Like he still has a little bit of that in Beverly Hills Cop, but here he's a little bit more pure. Like he's definitely not like he's obviously a con man, but it's like he kind of learns his lesson too. I was just a huge fan of this and their dynamic together at the end. I think they had some really good comedic chemistry, and I'm surprised. I mean, I know that Dan Aykroyd wanted Eddie Murphy to be a part of the Ghostbusters, and I can only imagine what that movie would have been like. But I have to say, I am disappointed by the fact that we did not get another collaboration between these two, because I think it could have worked really well.
I'll just say this, Jerome, based on our player conversation about legacy sequels last week, or the prior week before, but it's not too late, Jerome. It's not too late to make Eddie Murphy a Ghostbuster.
It's not going to happen, man. I mean, it's just not. I don't know what Eddie
Why
Murphy
not? At this point, at their age, it's like make as much money as they can. It's like John Cena turning heel. It's like it's their final moment to do it, right?
I mean, I guess if John Cena can turn heel, anything can happen, right? Spoiler alert for Elimination Chamber.
I don't care. I was a GCW.
Am I the one that broke the news to you, by the way, about that?
No, there was a crowd of people at a truck watching the show while I was at another truck smoking a joint. This was the parking lot of GCW, by the way.
That is the most Brian thing I think I've ever heard, quite frankly.
One of the more normal things I've done in that parking lot, actually, waiting for a GCW show.
I can only imagine. So,
I say, fuck those kids on the bikes in the fucking parking lot. They are the fucking dude, the kid on the fucking escalator in Mallrats. That's what was going on in the parking lot of GCW. Just as a side note, fuck them kids and their fucking bikes going in front of the fucking cars. There you go.
It's the angriest I've ever heard Brian. So, can you believe that this movie, in the year of our Lord 1983, this comes out the same summer as Return of the Jedi, Superman 3, and Octopussy?
Oh, I know. I've seen some of the episodes of Siskel and Ebert, and it's just so weird with the timing and everything, and it was just the fact that this was this the last year of Eddie Murphy on SNL, 83, or was it 85?
Yeah, I think he was. I think it was in 83 and 84. He did a lot of pre-recorded sketches. I don't know if you remember that element, but he was definitely like on the show, but only partially.
Yeah, as those
if
like
you
segments.
hosted when he was a cast member.
Yeah, that's
how
true.
unbelievable is that?
Yeah, it's crazy. Eddie Murphy was on top of the world at this point in a short amount of time, and that's kind of like the point of this podcast, is to show you this crazy rise in 1-2 year span for Eddie Murphy, and that's the beginning of his career.
And I also want to point out that Eddie Murphy did the very first rendition of Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood the same night as Prince made his national television debut. Think about that.
I know, it's quite historic, man, and they're kind of tied together in terms of like 80s icons too. So
I mean,
Yeah,
I
crazy.
tie Prince, Eddie Murphy, Michael Jackson, and Michael Jordan together. Like I just see those four as being like all debuting around the same time and having such an impact for such a long time.
Yeah, and let's leave Rick James out of that circle. We know some of those Rick James stories. And there's a scene in this movie. There's a scene in this movie where I was thinking Rick James is gonna pop out at the during the party scene because women were stripping their clothes, people were doing blow, all kinds of crazy shit starts going on, and I was expecting Rick James to just pop out of a closet.
I mean, but to me, I mean, I'm certainly not a music expert, but Michael Jackson and Prince crossed over into the mainstream, whereas I don't think Rick James did that nearly as much. Like Prince and Michael Jackson were ubiquitous. Michael Jordan, Eddie Murphy, they were ubiquitous. They had just as many white fans as they did black fans.
Yeah, it's just a joke that Rick James, produced Eddie Murphy's single, and if you see the video party all the time, he's just going crazy in the studio. So that's my Rick James connection there. But still, this movie highly recommended. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10 only because I have some issues with the script in terms of like where did all the money come from at the end? Like I thought they were broke, or at least Dan Aykroyd was broke.
I think you almost have to kind of write that off.
That's what I'm saying. It's like you have to kind of like, okay, that
it's an 8 out of 10. I think this is one of the best comedies of the '80s, and it's gotten to the point where it's underrated. I think
it's still memorable. Like I still feel like this gets a lot of like when you log on to Paramount Plus, highly recommended movies, Trading Places, like that pops up every once in a while for me. So I think with Jamie Lee Curtis's great performance and everyone's great performance and the great performance by the Butler, like I don't know, man. I still feel like this gets the love it deserves, but I don't know if it kind of slips under the radar now because the whole blackface thing maybe. But again, I don't know. I think maybe just run it again on TV a bunch of times, people will remember it again.
I think it's John Landis. I think John Landis too is kind of a no-go for a lot of people as well.
Well, his son didn't help either, so there you go.
I mean, what is to say that he is responsible for the deaths of 3 people, and the worst thing that John Landis ever created is still Max Landis? What does that tell you?
All I know is that Mac Landis bought me pizza during Bola in 2015, but that's a whole story.
I wouldn't have trusted it. Tastes like pain and shame.
I think I had a slice and then went to my friend's pad for about 20 minutes because he lived nearby, and those Bola intermissions, folks, can go on for a while. So there you go.
Everybody's got to go on a cousin walk during the intermission, I guess, right?
Yeah, that and Super Dragon's got to figure out what to do next because he was booking on the fly back in those days. So that's another inside joke there.
Right, we've had a pleasant conversation about Trading Places, which was spectacular. Next week, very simply, we're going to talk about one of the worst movies that we have ever discussed in our years of podcasting. This might be the worst movie that we have ever discussed. Harlem Nights. I know you don't feel this way. I think you are a little higher on this movie than I am. I think that Harlem Nights is so bad. It is Eddie Murphy's first and last movie as a director. And when we talk about this movie next week, you will understand why it was his first and last movie as a director.
Well, on the Catwoman scale, we'll talk about that next week. It's not it's not that low on the Catwoman scale. So let's put it that way.
I hate this movie so much. Anyway, we will talk to you again next week for Harlem Nights.